Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for February 24th, 2026. 4 years ago in the morning, we woke up to the news that Russian President Putin had initiated a special military operation designed to defend and protect the security and sovereignty of the Russian Federation. This occurred after years of attempting to convince the Western nations that Russia would not sit back while it was threatened with a military buildup in neighboring Ukraine. What Putin said is that the enlargement of NATO, which had continued since the early 1990s, was an existential threat to Russia. And he'd been waging this fight to get the West to recognize this over the preceding 20 years. Now, this was the same issue that was taken up after the fall of the Soviet Union, or the dismantling of the Soviet Union peacefully, when the Russians were promised by U.S. Secretary of State James Baker that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. And yet, over the next 20 years, NATO relentlessly moved closer and closer to the borders of Russia. Now, Baker's pledge was on February 9th, 1990 to Gorbachev. In 2008, it was recognized by then U.S. Ambassador to Russia, William Burns, that the move of NATO into Ukraine would be a threat to Russia. In his famous memo, "Niet means niet," no means no. But it was ignored, and instead the pressure continued. In 2014, in February, so now we're talking about 12 years ago, there was a coup carried out, a regime change coup in Ukraine, funded by the US, the CIA, and British intelligence, and probably some NATO forces as well. The intent of this was to force or to bring Ukraine into NATO. And that was done at the force of arms from neo-Nazi brigades deployed in the capital city of Kiev. There were efforts to try to reverse this, to stop it, but they failed. There was the Minsk Accords, one in September 2014, then again in February 2015, where there were pledges to achieve a peace based on mutual security. And yet it turned out that the leaders who made the pledges, in this case Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, and Hollande, the President of France, they acknowledged years later that they were lying, that they had no intention of letting up the pressure on Russia. In fact, they were using the Minsk Accord to buy time, to arm and train the Ukrainian military, to bring it up to NATO standards, and to put troops and weapons on the border. Now, over a period of time from 2014 to 2022, 14,000 people were killed in eastern Ukraine, most of them Russian-speaking Ukrainian citizens who lived in the east, in the Donbas region. And the efforts to stop that fighting did not succeed. And in fact, before the special military operation was launched by Putin, there were reports of a massing of troops on the Ukrainian side of the border that were prepared to go into eastern Ukraine to wipe out the resistance from the pro-Russian supporters there. And it was to prevent that kind of massacre that the special military operation was launched. Now, immediately after it was launched, what did we hear? Over and over and over, that this was an unprovoked response by Russia. Now, the fact that they called it unprovoked meant they knew that it was actually provoked, because you don't use the term unprovoked unless you actually think that there was a provocation. And there was. Putin made it clear over and over and over. Now, one of the points the Russians made is they compared this to the Cuba Missile Crisis, when in 1962 the Soviet Union moved nuclear weapons into Cuba, 90 miles from the United States. And President Kennedy acted on two tracks to this. First, demanding that the missiles be removed and carrying out a blockade of Cuba to keep more missiles from coming in. But at the same time, he launched a back-channel negotiation that was moving towards an end to the confrontation between East and West, a true détente. And he was killed before that could happen. Now, that's an indication that it's correct for nations to say we don't want weapons by hostile powers on our borders. That's what Putin was saying. But the West wouldn't accept it. And as a result, we've seen a constant escalation of the war from the West, from the European Union, from NATO, from, in particular, the so-called E3 countries, European 3 countries, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. Now, in that period of time, we've seen millions of casualties on both sides, especially on the Ukrainian side. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent, and fools like Senator Lindsey Graham have come forward to say this is money well spent because we're killing Russians and we're not getting killed in return. That is, we're getting others, namely Ukrainians, to die killing Russians. Now, other indications, just to remind you of what was going on, the chief negotiator in Belarus, who was Ukrainian in the 2022 negotiations, was shot and killed by the Secret Service of Ukraine. When there were agreements reached in the Istanbul conference between Ukraine and Russia, and they were about to sign a peace treaty, Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, flew into Kiev and told them, don't sign this. We'll continue to fund your war efforts. And they did, to the tune of tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, this has been the situation since 2022. Large numbers of casualties, continuous war, lying from the West, setups, and so on. And the Russians have continued to negotiate in good faith, but the West has not. And the West continues to use the line, the narrative, that Russia acted in an unprovoked manner. Now, today, on the 4th year anniversary of that launching of the special military operation, a team of European Union kleptocrats are turning up in Kiev, led by Ursula von der Leyen and the other representatives of the European Union, including from 10 heads of state from 10 EU countries. And what are they going there for? To work out a peace agreement? No, to demand more sanctions against Russia and to demand a longer war, and to say that they will continue to fund the war in Ukraine for the intent, and this is what they don't say, but for the intent of breaking up Russia to be able to seize the raw materials of the Russian state. Now, in the midst of this, they've had one sanctions package after another aimed at crippling Russia's economy. So far, they haven't succeeded. They were trying to push through the 20th such sanctions policy this week. But Hungary drew its feet in the sand and said, no more, not in our name. And as a result, it put a stop to the EU plan to bring down Russia through breaking it apart. Now, what's the goal of the West? It's precisely to protect the colonial era where the powerful Western nations are able to take over control of flow of money, investments, and so on, to keep the Western European countries in the war. Keep them in the war. On behalf of the same free trading oligarchy, which is moving to clamp down with the same policy throughout Eastern Europe. Now, this is coming to a confrontation point because there's at least one country which refuses to go along, and that's Hungary. And Hungary blocked the 20th round of sanctions. And what do they get for it? They're getting sanctioned. And the oil and gas from Russia to Hungary is being shut off by the European Union. So what we're dealing with is an intransigent West stuck with an idea that they have to stop Russia, break up Russia, in order to secure a weakening of the potentially unified states against them. That's why there's a war in Ukraine right now. That's why there's a big debate over whether the former president should whether there should be a breakup, continued sanctions to aim to weaken Russia to the point of regime change. That's the policy. President Trump said he would stop it. He's been unable to do it. And in the meantime, he's under enormous pressure to launch a strike against Iran. So we are calling on the citizens of the Western nations to stop being passive in the face of the destruction of your countries and your country's commitment to a genocidal global policy of sanctions, of warfare, permanent warfare, and join the global majority in not just stopping the fighting, but moving to a new economic development architecture and a new security architecture in which the security needs of every nation are recognized and prioritized. 4 years in, are we going to continue with this until we get to a nuclear war, or are we going to put an end to it? Now is the time to put an end to it. And I call on you to join with us to support that effort, to join us to make sure that the deep state, that the war hawks, the neocons, the neoliberals, the neo-everythings are put out of business, and instead we have a world in which human beings negotiate peace based on their common interests and common needs.